Thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Grand Island Independent Podcast, The Real Night of the Twisters, sponsored by T.O. Haas Tire. T.O. Haas Tire is the home of the courtesy inspection where they check your brakes, belts, hoses, fluids, tires, and more absolutely free. T.O. Haas Tire, a tradition of trust since 1947. I'm your host, Josh Salmon. Today we start a 6-part series about the real night of the Twisters. The night 6 to 8 tornadoes touched down in Grand Island, Nebraska, and not only destroyed a good large portion of the town, but also took 5 lives. Those who lived in Grand Island during that time will never forget that night. The Independent's Robert Poor visited with Mike Moritz of the National Weather Service in Hastings about the famous night 41 years ago, June 3rd, 1980. Moritz was a child at the time living in Aurora, and although they didn't have any tornadoes in his area, he remembers the storm that came with it and heading to the basement when the sirens rang. Since that night, Moritz has been fascinated with weather. He spent much of his time over his 28 years as a meteorologist studying that historic night.
Mike, do you remember where you were June 3rd, 1980?
I do remember where I was. I was in Aurora, and I was in my basement most of the night. I probably, like a lot of young kids at that time, I remember my dad sticking his head outside the back door, trying to figure out what was going on, trying to hear the tornado sirens, things like that. And, you know, in Aurora, we didn't get a tornado, but we did get the downstream effects of the event, which was a lot of heavy rain. I remember some quarter size, maybe 1-inch diameter type hail, and some flooding throughout the Aurora area and generally in Hamilton County. So I, like a lot of other people, was just trying to stay away from the storm.
This must have been one of those events that got you interested as a kid in weather.
Yeah, it was. You know, like I said, my initial interest in weather was snow, and something about snow was just how it formed and you know, how it could come and go and blow and just something about snow, I think, as a kid is a lot of fun. But this is probably the event from a severe weather standpoint that I most remember as a kid. I mean, I'm sure there were plenty of other tornadoes or flash flooding events or high wind events, but yeah, this one really sticks out to me as a kid, and probably piqued more of an interest as I got older in severe weather.
What actually happened on June 3rd, 1980 in this area, especially in Grand Island?
I would imagine that June 3rd was probably like any other June 3rd. It was sunny and it was warm and it was humid. But what actually happened was a huge supercell developed, kind of a lone wolf in the area, northwest of Grand Island, actually up around the Howard County line or in that general vicinity. And so in that sense, it probably wasn't any different than any other day. We have thunderstorms in June. It's kind of our peak severe weather time. But this was the only game in town, really, in the region. And that storm just sort of took over northern Hall County, northeastern Hall County, and then adjacent sections downstream from there. And so eventually, after 8:30, 8:45, tornadoes started coming down, and they started impacting the city of Grand Island throughout the city from northwest to southeast. So that lasted for over 2 hours, which was just as we already know, a lot of damage and a really devastating event. But I already mentioned that, downstream, we got different effects from it. We've got heavy rain and flooding throughout the night. We had over 6 inches of rain in Hamilton County, and that causes problems. And we had hail and wind. So in one sense, it was probably a fairly normal June night. In another sense, it was nothing but normal.
Yeah, the day started out with only a 20% chance of thunderstorms that evening. What happened to make that kind of well, in your words, a bad forecast?
Well, I don't know if it was a bad forecast. I think maybe it was a typical forecast, right? We've all heard that 20% chance for thunderstorms. I mean, and we sort of hedge our bets about what we're going to do, right? We say, well, it's a 20% chance, and that's probably not going to rain really. So I'm just going to kind of do my thing, as opposed to maybe an 80% chance, right? So in that sense, it was probably a typical forecast. When it comes to forecasting, 2020 is 2020 hindsight is the best, right? We can always look back and say, well, why did that happen? Here's what happened. Why did that happen? And actually, when you kind of look back at June 3rd, with the hindsight of not only a few years or a few days, you got 40 years to look back at it, you see a lot of the same ingredients that we have today. We had a tremendous amount of instability, and we talk about that when we talk about thunderstorm development. It was there. We had just the right wind shear. We talk about that when we think of supercell thunderstorms. It was there. And the last thing we had a very focused area of lift in the area. Actually had a warm front that had pushed north into southern Nebraska, and that provides the impetus for the thunderstorm to really get going. When you have those things, anything is really possible. But even today, as a forecaster, you can't be 100% sure that certain things will happen at certain times. So, like I said, I don't know that it was a terrible forecast, because if you look at the same forecast was issued for Hastings and for Kearney and for southwestern Hall County, and there was almost no precipitation there, no thunderstorm there. So it wasn't necessarily a bad forecast there. It was just, unfortunately, a bad result in Grand Island proper.
But there are some lessons to learn. I mean, technology has improved dramatically over the last 40 years when it comes to weather forecasting. But still, this is an example how something that looks benign early can turn into something deadly later. Weather can't be 100% forecasted because there's so many variables.
Oh, absolutely. And I hope that, and I believe that, people in our region and in the Central Plains in Nebraska, they are highly weather in tune, and they understand the extremes that we have here. But you're exactly right. And I mentioned that, we know that certain things could happen, but we don't necessarily know that they will happen. And so we need to be available. We need to allow ourselves to evolve as the weather evolves. What might seem like a fairly benign situation impacting our daily lives as we go about our business might turn into a much more serious situation pretty quickly. And that's, I think, kind of the way I looked at Grand Island, or way I look at Grand Island is initially it was a storm off in the distance, a slow mover as it drifted to the southeast, and it wasn't necessarily going to be that big of an issue. But by the time it reaches northern Hall County and Grand Island, and it doesn't go anywhere, it becomes the most significant event to affect the area, probably in recorded history.
That's right. And that's a good lesson for people to still remember. Don't take any forecast for granted. Always be alert.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are getting better. I think that we do have a better handle on when more significant severe weather events will happen. We have timing down pretty well. We even have a pretty good idea of how an event will evolve. But even though the parameters were there for this event, it was a little bit more of a subtle event, and those events are still very difficult for us to get a really solid handle on, even in today's forecasting technology.
Coming back, Mike Moritz talks about the science of what happened and how rare it was when Real Night of the Twisters continues.
When it's time to hit the road, the last thing you need to worry about is your vehicle. At T.O. Haas Tire, we'll inspect your brakes, belts, hoses, fluid, suspension, tires, and more. All done by a certified technician, and all done absolutely free. And don't forget, we have a tire for every vehicle and every budget with optimum tire wear, fuel economy, and most importantly, driver safety.
T.O. Haas Tire and Auto, a tradition of trust.
Welcome back to the Grand Island Independent Podcast. Before the break, independent reporter Robert Poore was talking to Mike Moritz of the National Weather Service in Hastings, a meteorologist for almost 30 years. Moritz dissects the science behind that unique and historic night on June 3rd, 1980, the real night of the Twisters.
What happened on June 3rd? How unique is that from your perspective as a meteorologist?
Well, and I think we got to go back in time too and think 40 some years ago, we didn't necessarily have the database of tornadoes we have today. So even putting it in that context makes Grand Island more unique. Clearly there are some things we see today. It was a very slow moving storm. It just drifted southeast and really just sort of got stuck over the Grand Island area. That's pretty darn unique type of storm for a supercell to do that. Probably the most unique part of this, besides the total number of tornadoes, which we know that supercells have the opportunity or sometimes like to produce more than one tornado. And that's obviously what happened here. But of those 7 tornadoes, 3 of them rotated the opposite direction. So typically a tornado would rotate cyclonically, and we had 4 of those, which we would expect, but we also had 3 anticyclonic tornadoes. And one of those in particular, which was the one that hit the northern part of Grand Island and actually ended up in the Veterans Home area, was actually a pretty strong anticyclonic tornado. So that was very unusual. There hadn't been much documentation of not only anticyclonic tornadoes, but damaging, stronger anticyclonic tornadoes, because typically they are a little bit weaker. But this was a very unique event, and I think those are some of the things that really stand out: the slow moving nature, the localized damage, and then this idea that we have 3 out of the 7 rotating the opposite direction and doing damage was pretty darn unique.
Well, talk about the damage. Anyone who looks at photographs or pictures of South Locust and other parts of Grand Island, that was a very, very damaging tornadoes. But the amazing thing, you look at, only 5 people died because of those tornadoes. You look at a recent storm like down in Alabama. There was still a lot of damage down there and death. What made this so unique in the sense that it only killed 5 people?
Well, I think one thing that was probably helpful in that sense was that it was a slow mover. The storms recently in Alabama were fast-moving supercell storms. There was very good warning on them, but they were fast-moving events that could catch someone who was not watching the weather close, off guard. In this case, the Grand Island supercell was a slow mover. If you were out that evening, you could probably see it. You would see it coming at you from the northwest, so you'd have some sense that, hey, the weather was changing, and this is going to influence my evening here, and maybe I need to adjust things. I also think that when you think about the time, just as society, it's not that we weren't doing anything 40 years ago, because we had baseball games and other things outside and people were doing their thing, but we were probably a little less mobile society 40 years ago. So maybe not as many people were out and about. Also, just less people lived in the general area. That could have been possibly a play, and because they're giving us an idea of only 5 people had passed away. Also, I think there was a strong local media presence on TV, on the radio, that once these storms developed, that information was getting out and people were going to those sources as long as they could when they had power, and they were watching these things to get more information as they could, even though it was probably really very sketchy information. And I think also at that time there was a heavier reliance on outdoor warning devices. As I grew up, we would have called them tornado sirens. Mm-hmm. And so people were looking for information from the sounding of those sirens. And I think all of those things come into play when you talk about getting weather information, getting warning information, and probably just adding it up, the resilience and the preparedness of the community of Grand Island and Hall County brings all that together and probably played a key role in keeping fatalities on the low side, along with the warning information as well.
Mike, thanks a lot for spending your time with us.
Thanks for having me, Robert. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
That wraps up this episode of the Real Night of the Twisters podcast, episode 1, and from the Grand Island Independent. On our next episode, our very own Brandon Summers will visit with people who remember the aftermath and the lives that were lost on that fateful summer night. Join us next time for the Grand Island Independent's podcast series, The Real Night of the Twisters, sponsored by T.O. Haas Tire. T.O. Haas Tire is the home of the courtesy inspection, where they check your brakes, belts, hoses, fluids, tires, and more, absolutely free. T.O. Haas Tire, a tradition of trust since 1947. We would like to thank Mike Moritz of the National Weather Service in Hastings, Robert Poore of the Grand Island Independent, written, narrated, and produced by Josh Salmon. This has been a production of the Grand Island Independent, copyright 2021. Until next time, we'll see you.